Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining the Behind Company Lines podcast. Today we have Ajay Kulkarni, CEO of Timescale. Timescale are the creator of the leading cloud database platform for the time series, events, and more built on Postgres. Ajay, it's so exciting to chat with you, not only because of your background, your experience building startups, but also Timescale and what you're working on now, and really kind of a lot of the it seems like the development and changes in the developer ecosystem are so fascinated to really kind of tackle issues, whether it's around productivity, access to resource information, time to actually completing a certain objective. So many things that we see a lot of companies offering for developers to kind of speed up the overall process or even just make it more efficient, more effective. Before we get into all that, what were you doing before you started the company? What are
Yeah,
the many things?
yeah. So I mean, I've been I guess in startups and entrepreneur for a while. 14, 15 years ago, I started my previous company. I was in the mobile space. It was like 2008, 2009. This is right when the iPhone was new, and we were actually on BlackBerry. So in hindsight, picked the wrong platform. But at one point, we were
Yeah.
the leading address book app on BlackBerry devices. It had like hundreds of thousands of downloads. Ended up being an okay success story. We were acquired by another company, which was then acquired by Skype, which was then acquired by Microsoft. So I found myself investing in Microsoft, feeling very comfortable, but also feeling like I was too young to feel
Yeah.
comfortable. I was like probably like early to mid 30s.
Yeah.
And in parallel, my co-founder Mike, whom I've known for like 25 years, we were roommates at MIT. He went down a different path. He stayed in academia. He got his PhD from NYU/Stanford. He also sold the company along the way, and then he became a tenured professor of computer science at Princeton. So pretty prestigious. But at that point, I think he also felt like a little too comfortable for comfort.
Yeah.
So we teamed up to work together, and then we started off working on a different company around IoT. But that then led to Timescale, and then we relaunched this Timescale early 2017, nearly 6 years ago, and the company has felt like a rocket ship since then.
Yeah, it's incredible to think about the journey that you've had, and just curious. I always like to ask founders about the acquisition story, and in respect to when you received the offers you were receiving, what was the decision making process? And essentially, because you probably had maybe a few people who were interested, or maybe you didn't, maybe there was one particular party, but what made you go with whom you did at the time, and would you have done it differently?
I think in hindsight, I think we did it perfectly, but that's
Yeah,
not because we were brilliant. I think we were like smart, but like, I think we also got a little lucky. No,
yeah,
so so this is probably early 2011. We were
yeah,
probably in this business for like a couple, 2, 3 years, and we could tell by 2011 that we'd picked the wrong platform, and I kind of like very much, and I have this great like, God, there's so many like lessons learned. Like one was I remember talking to my dad, who also used to
yeah.
be a tech entrepreneur, and my dad was like, "Why are you building on BlackBerry?" Like, feels like you're building on like Unix in a Windows world. That's
Yeah,
what he grew
yeah,
up in. But I also like remember thinking like we're the leading address book on BlackBerry, but like I learned that it doesn't matter if you're the tallest person on a sinking ship, you're still
yeah,
going down with the ship.
yeah,
And so we had a few offers. The company that we ended up accepting the offer from was actually pretty small. It was another startup, a little bit bigger than us. Maybe we were like two people. They were like 20, 30 people. But we
yeah,
could tell that it was in a group messaging space. We could just tell this was going to be like a great company, great success. And what's wild, so that's why we picked it. But
yeah,
I think, and in hindsight, like we timed it so well because I remember the day we signed the term sheet from them was February 14th,
yeah.
2011. 6 months later, BlackBerry stock had cratered by 75%.
Wow, wow.
So
Yeah,
I knew BlackBerry was like the wrong platform, but I expected it to go down that quickly.
yeah.
But in hindsight, we picked a great company.
What was that transition period like? Because you signed the papers in 2011, but you were on for another, I think, 3 years working with the company. Or were you transitioning kind of the team into the new organization? What was that relationship during that transition period?
Yeah, initially we thought our BlackBerry app would be the foundation for their BlackBerry app. They were a group messaging company called GroupMe, but then we quickly realized that it didn't make any sense to be on BlackBerry. But I
Yeah.
think my co-founder in that company was another old friend, and he's a great software developer named Andy. And then with my background engineering and product, we just naturally fit into the larger company.
Yeah.
And I ended up eventually heading up all mobile applications for the company. So
Yeah.
iOS, Android, Windows Phone, although I even like built part of the Windows Phone app. But it's pretty seamless. I don't know, like I think we picked a company where we're just like like we just loved the mission, really respected the founders. Yeah, and I remember thinking, like, we had a few other companies we were looking at that time, and I remember thinking, like, if I had to buy stock in one of these companies, I would buy it in this one. It's
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
even though
yeah,
it's like a little bit riskier because it's a startup, I'll like buy it in this one, and it was ended up being the right choice.
yeah. And what was the, I guess, the signals that you were seeing to feel so confident in the decision that you made? Anything in particular that you thought, in comparison to the other companies that could have acquired you, or that you could have worked with,
Yeah.
basically with was it an acquihire, or was it just you were acquired, you were transitioning? What was that process like, and what were the signals that you saw for that company?
Yeah, I mean,
That
I
you,
think it eventually ended up becoming an acquihire. I think the idea
yeah,
was that they were also buying the assets and it would be the foundation for their BlackBerry app, but it ended up being an acquihire because we didn't develop the BlackBerry app after a while. I'm like, I was a lot less experienced than I am now. This is like
sure.
10, 12 years ago. But like, I just knew it was a company called GroupMe. Have you used
Hmm.
GroupMe?
Yeah, back in the day, I did.
Yeah, so it was GroupMe, so group
Yeah,
messaging
yeah,
app.
yeah,
And,
yeah, yeah.
and I remember the first time I used GroupMe, this is before they had apps, it was just text based. And I had spent the last 10 years in mobile. I actually worked for in the mid 2000s, I worked for a mobile search company called 4Info, which was one of the first companies to do mobile search. It was all text based. So I had a lot of experience in tech and texting and the SMS world. In fact, one of my old coworkers was Garth, was actually an advisor to GroupMe. So it was a weird connection. I
Yeah,
remember using this product for the first time and it just felt magical.
yeah,
It just
yeah.
felt magical. And I don't know, like I felt like we were trying to, like we both had the same mission, which was like to turn your contacts into relationships. Like your
Mhm,
real social network, right, was the people you actually
mhm.
talk to. And I remember like we're like, oh wow, like we tried to do this with a better address book, but they
Yeah,
did it with a better form of communicating, like a better communications medium.
yeah,
And I'm like, oh, that's
yeah,
so powerful because it's so fundamental. And that was like one of my early lessons was like, hey, like whatever you're thinking, think bigger. Like,
yeah,
what's better than an address book? How about a better way of talking? You know?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And so I remember
exactly.
using it. I remember just being blown away. I'm like, this is just magical. And this is still pretty early. Um, yeah.
Yeah.
It just felt, yeah.
Nowadays, it seems like the better experience is what everybody's striving for with all companies as they build. But it seems like at the time, they were a little bit of ahead of the curve in that respect. But I guess more so towards timescale, the shifting the conversation.
Yep.
So where was your head at, and what in particular, what were you interested in terms of real time data series? Was that always kind of the way you were going to go, or where did you come up with the idea? What ideas were preceding timescale what it is now, and how did it evolve to get to where it is today?
Well, it definitely evolved because as I alluded, like we ended up pivoting to timescale.
Yeah.
We actually started off building an IoT company. And the inspiration for timescale was simple. We needed a special kind of database for IoT company. We wanted something that offered SQL and scaled and offered the
Yeah.
relational database model. And no one was building it. So kind of as a last resort, we were like, I guess we have to build it ourselves. So we built it
Mhm.
ourselves. And then we realized that everyone kept asking us a lot more questions about the database we had built than about the
Yeah.
IoT product. Like I remember being in a meeting with this large 100-year-old logistics company.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to some software architect about our IoT platform, and his eyes are glazing over, and he's like, "Okay, how are you different than the other 500 IoT platforms?" Like, "Oh, we built this database and offers SQL and it scales." And I remember he like literally leaned forward in his seat, and he was like, "Can you tell me more about that? Because that actually sounds interesting. Because we're using Cassandra and it's not really scaling." And like
Yeah.
at that point, like I'd already gone through my previous adventure with my previous company, so I kind of learned how to listen for cues. And
Yeah.
if someone says, "Oh, that's cool," that means it's not cool.
Right.
But if
Right.
someone
Right.
is actually like leans in and they're like, wait, can you go back to that? That's
Yeah.
when you're like, oh, okay, so there's something there. I'm not sure what it is, but it's definitely more than this IoT thing. And so we realized that this database we were building was solving was a bigger problem than the IoT product. Relaunched as Timescale in early 2017, and yeah, I mean, it's been like a rocket ship since then.
And what were people using before timescale, and what was the biggest? I get pet. It sounds like scalability was the biggest headache for a lot of companies, and what were
Yeah.
companies using before that time?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the database history, I think the relational database came about in the late 70s, let's say maybe 80s and 90s with the age of the relational database, the rise of Oracle and SQL Server, and then later Postgres and MySQL. The 2000s were probably 2010 was probably the era of like people saying, "Hey, the relational model doesn't scale, SQL doesn't scale, we need NoSQL," and see the rise of Cassandra and Mongo. a lot of other companies that don't exist anymore. And so by the time like we came around and we were building our thing in 2015, the general accepted, I don't know, practice was, hey, relational databases are great, but they don't scale. And so if you want something that scales, you have to switch to something that's non-relational, which is kind of like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because you're like, oh, like, do you want something that's easy to use and versatile and works with everything? Or do you want something that has none of the above but scales? And you're kind of like, well, I kind of want both. Like, can I have both? And we were using actually an off-the-shelf time series database at the time, which like didn't offer us both, and it was really frustrating. And so we were like, yes, we have to build it. It was literally like being reluctantly like pulled to build this thing because no one else was doing it. And I actually remember meeting with one of the founders of one of the database companies and meeting with them and realizing, oh, they're not going to do this.
Yeah.
So we have to do, only because we have this problem. We weren't even trying to sell it.
Why didn't it scale?
Yeah.
Why didn't it scale? Yeah, you said it for the non-technical.
Yeah, there's kind of, it was kind of like this theory. Here's what happened. What happened is that in 2000, some of the early internet giants like Amazon and Google, they were like some of the first companies at true internet scale. And so they built the first real kind of non-relational databases. I think Google had, I think it was Bigtable, and Amazon had essentially what became DynamoDB, essentially. And every company was like, oh, I want to be an Amazon, I want to be a Google, so I'm going to adopt these things at scale.
Yeah.
And then like by 2015, most people realized, hey, like you are not going to be the next Google. Like it's like you can still be a huge success story, but you're probably not going to have data at Google scale. And even Google was like, hey, like this, we were wrong. And they actually, Google built something called Spanner, which is a relational database that scaled. So essentially it was almost like Google and Amazon were on the cutting edge. They're like, oh, we have to do this thing that's non-relational. And then I think, and Amazon was also for a long time a huge Oracle customer. I think the market then was like, oh, we want to be the next Google. And then by 2015, Google and Amazon had kind of switched back, but the market hadn't. And I remember when we launched, like the top comments in Hacker News were like, this is a stupid idea. How much you want to do this? And like, you can't scale Postgres. And we would say, no, you can. It's just really hard, but you can. And we did it. And I think, I don't know, I think that's been the key thing, is like not accepting things to be impossible, but like tackling the things that really kind of move the needle.
Yeah, well, it sounds fascinating based on your previous experience and kind of expanding onto what possibilities are out there, or even that you can kind of think of and conceive, even if the technology is not built. You get to this position with Timescale before, obviously, you named it Timescale, and seeing that everything everyone has been saying about the databases aren't scalable, finding a way to do that. It sounds like that kind of, that was the precursor to the I guess maybe the perspective you had at the time when you kind of made the transition into expanding it. What helped you? I'm curious, because you had a conversation with the database company. Why weren't they building it? If they had kind of seen that was the next evolution of their product from all the customer conversations that you've had and all the people you've worked with in your own experience, what was the reason why they weren't focusing on building that and focusing on other things?
It's a good question. I mean, I think the reality is that as software applications have become more complex, I think there just is a new crop of data challenges that were happening.
Yeah.
One thing we like to talk about at Timescale is the future of computing.
Yeah.
And so in the beginning, we were like, oh, hey, this is a database that doesn't exist, we need to build it. But as soon as we launched, like the immediate response was way bigger than we expected. And in fact, every year, like company keeps growing and growing. So like our understanding of the problem and our vision has grown as well.
Yeah.
And so like I think what we saw that maybe other people did not see is that like the future of computing, it's not just big data. It's like, because big data kind of implies like data warehousing and things like Snowflake. It's kind of like these data intensive applications, like applications that are real time, that are built on large data sets. And what you need for those is like, you need Postgres and you need scale.
Yeah.
And so what we talk about now at Timescale is like, hey, we exist like to help build the future of computing. And when we say future, does that make sense when I say future of computing, or should I kind of take it?
Go into it. Yeah, go into it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, so like at our core, like at our heart, at Timescale, I like to think we're optimists.
Yeah.
And we're especially optimistic about like the power of technology to like solve problems and to make the world a better place. My co-founder Mike has his great, he likes to say this thing, which is like, hey, like banning plastic straws like won't solve climate change.
Yeah.
Like that's, I mean, like, okay, sure, like you can do that if you want, but that's actually not going to solve the problem. Like we have to build our way out of the problem to the solution. And that's how we view at Timescales. We want to help build for the builders. And today we have over 1,000 customers. 6 years later, 1,000 customers are all, we say, building the future of computing on Timescale. In case it helps, I can go through a few of them. One
I
of
was
them
going to
is
ask.
you know, I mean, like, it's some really awesome, I think, stories, in my opinion, which is also what makes this fun, because every time I learn about a new customer, it's like so exciting. One of them is a company called Everactive. They make battery-less sensors, so sensors that are extremely low power that harvest like ambient temperature, kinetic energy to self-power themselves. It's like, it's wild. But they actually build these sensors to help companies like Pfizer and Siemens reduce energy wastage and carbon emissions. And that's built on Timescale. You're like, oh, that's really cool. There's a company in India called Blue Sky Analytics that's built essentially the Bloomberg for environmental data. And they essentially offer that to people to drive sustainable decision making. That's built on Timescale. We even have like a major US record label that collects kind of real-time signals from Spotify and SoundCloud, which is a great example of, I think, software eating the world, or whatever you want to call it, because as music consumption has moved from offline to online, from like records and CDs to like Spotify and SoundCloud, the amount of data you can collect and the ability to make decisions on that data has increased, right? So I'm talking about kind of data-intensive applications. They're essentially collecting signals from Spotify and SoundCloud to help identify the next breakout artist. And I don't know, like, I like to think that access to great music makes the world a better place.
It's so fascinating thinking about the amount of use cases that the product is valuable for, and this whole kind of I guess obviously it's been over the past few years, but even more so companies are focusing on data, whether it's creating better formats for data labeling, creating better bases to actually collect larger bits of information, better analytic tools. What is that essentially? Obviously, you gave us some examples of those customers, but I guess on a grand scale, what are we going to see in terms of not only data consumption, analysis, but this whole collection, this whole ecosystem around data? The more knowledge that we have, the better predictions we can make. Where do you think we're going in that direction in terms of that data gets larger, more accessible, there's more insights gathered? What are some of your predictions, or what are some of your optimisms around the evolution of it?
I like that word, optimisms. Yeah, I like that. Optimism. Optimistic predictions, maybe. Yeah, that's cool. I like that. I'm going to steal that. Yeah. So number one, we believe that every company today is either a software company, is becoming a software company, or is getting replaced by a software company. So like in music, Spotify, SoundCloud, software companies. This record label customer talked about is becoming a software company. And then anyone who is not embracing software is getting replaced by a software company. And great software is built on great databases. And as long as software's been around, they've been powered by great databases. But what's happened lately, and kind of the music example, even the other examples, hopefully like kind of illustrate, is that we like to say data is eating software. And in fact, like modern applications are extremely demanding of their database. And so like back in the day, you might have had these CRUD apps, create, read, update, delete, kind of basic. Oh, like, well, what's Julian's account? Okay, let's update his email address. Okay, done. He bought something. Okay, cool. Transaction done. And a lot of applications like that today, but you have the rise of these data-intensive applications, which have a very different workload pattern. It's a workload pattern that doesn't have a name. Internally, we call it AWESOME, which stands for append, update, scan, materialize. But the idea is that like sensor data is a great example. Sensor data, you're generally writing data in order, so you're appending. You might update every now and then. Okay, cool, because you may be able to correct a reading. But when you're actually analyzing data, you're not looking up like one value, like what was the reading at this point in time. You're doing a scan. You're saying, hey, like what was the average, I don't know, temperature in this room by 5 minutes for the past, I don't know, 24 hours. And that's like a scan, right? And then you're materializing that into these like kind of these aggregated views as well. And but that's a super technical way of just saying that, like, I think the nature of these workloads are getting very complicated. And one of my optimisms, if you will, is that like software developers, I think software developers are also fundamentally optimists. I think they're just pushing, like as compute gets more powerful, storage gets cheaper, they keep just pushing the envelope of what's possible in order to build these great data-driven, data-intensive applications. And I think the future is more of that. And I think like I don't know, like we've often thought about this. It's like big data feels so cliche now because like everything's big data. What do you mean? Everything's big data. But so I don't know what you call this new thing. But this new thing is like big data times 10 or times 100. It's like, because it's like
Yeah.
constant. It's like time series data is, we say, is the highest fidelity of data you can capture.
Yeah.
So I think there's gonna be more of that, and I think that's gonna help us just build better applications, build better, help us understand what's going on in music consumption, in the environment, help us build
Yeah.
better things, help us better understand the world, help better understand our software and ourselves, and any kind of wearable device is generating this
Yeah.
type of data. Yeah, so every company's becoming a software company. Software companies are building great databases, and data is eating software.
Yeah. Yeah. You're thinking about whether it's external or internal. What are some of the biggest risks as a company faces today? Being that you have so many use cases, you have a lot of adaptability. It's a very flexible product in terms
Yeah.
of where you can plug it in. So everything sounds great on paper, but in terms of the overall environment, what kind of keeps you up at night? What do you think about in terms of what kind of risk that the company can take on or can face as you move forward and as you scale and as you go and have more adoption?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully it doesn't come across as a cliche answer, but I truly believe it. We have a great opportunity. So the opportunity is unbounded. Unbounded. We think it's huge. We have a great team. We have enough runway for a while, so not worried about that either. We have a great, growing, healthy business. Not worried about that either. What keeps me up at night is, and I think our biggest risk is that we lose focus.
Yeah.
That we lose as we get bigger, that we lose our sense of urgency, that we become internally oriented as opposed to customer oriented.
Yeah.
I think, and you can look at every company, like I think this is natural entropy that happens, that every company experiences as it gets bigger. Like when you're
Right.
small, it's really easy to be nimble, focus on customers. And this is why I think startups often are like Davids to like the Goliaths, kind of take down larger companies.
Right.
Because as you get larger, it's just tempting to spend all your time in internal discussions, building,
Right.
I don't know, Google slide decks, and to just debate things that don't really matter, right?
Right.
And I think the best companies still act like and think like a small company, even when they're large.
Right.
So yeah, so I think what I tell our team is like, hey, this is our game to lose.
Right.
Like we're in the
Right.
driver's seat, we're in control of our destiny, but it's our game to, like, we can still lose it, right? So we need to stay
Right.
focused, and I believe that any problems that come up, we have to tackle these problems with boldness, optimism, and urgency.
Yeah. And how do you combat that? Is it team values? Is it keeping a certain structure in terms of reinforcing those values, keeping a
Yeah.
structure in terms of conversation? How do you combat that as leader, making sure you don't have I guess, the first world problems of a company, which are focusing internally and building things internally versus keeping things in terms of customer motivated?
Yeah, I think you have to hire a great team and then kind of embed them in a great culture. And you have
Yeah.
to constantly make your team better, up-level your team, and up-level I'm just constantly trying to up-level myself
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
try to
Yeah.
up-level your culture. So an example of that is like our company values today they include things like, hey, let the best idea win no matter who says it.
Yeah.
And one thing I love to tell new people is like, hey, if I'm wrong, call me out on it, because I'm not here to be right. I don't care about my ego.
Yeah.
I don't care. I just want to make sure we get to the right answer. And
Right.
if I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. Like there's no like,
Yeah.
and if at any point like someone's seniority or someone's like they're the loudest voice, if their answer won because that, not on the merits of the argument, then we're losing. So love to instill that. Another thing we like to talk about is narrow the focus.
Mm.
So again, it's like as you get bigger, you'll often do more and more things. But actually, as you get bigger, everything gets harder. So you actually have to narrow your focus. It's almost like
Right.
counterintuitive. As you get bigger, you
Right.
have to think more narrowly, and then we're constantly narrowing our focus and thinking about things to cut. And yeah, another one is shorten the cycle. Like
Right.
I'm like, hey, like I'm assuming if you're at Timescale, you're a great individual and you're hardworking and you're probably working as hard as you can. So I'm not looking for you to like work 24/7, because that just leads to burnout. It's not sustainable. It's not sustainable.
Right.
But
Right.
it doesn't mean we can't move faster. Okay, then how do you move faster? Well, you shorten the cycle. You're like, hey, this decision that took us a month, could we made it in a week? Could we
Yeah.
made it in a day? Right? Like if there's some decisions that are reversible, then make it and then reverse it. If it's irreversible, okay, let's debate it. But and like I remember one time my co-founder called me out and he's like, hey, Ajay, like if we do this and we get it wrong, what's the downside? And I'm like, nothing. Let's do it.
Right.
He's like, then do we have to debate this? I'm like, no, we don't.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a total.
Such a good
So
culture. I was gonna say it's such a good culture and kind of orienting around figuring out what the best solution is and making fast and quick decisions. And how do you find the right talent that kind of continues to come in and maintain those values, maintain that culture, because talent is a huge headache for so many founders. And it's not about the skill set, because there's a bunch of people in this world who have the exact skills that you need, but it's about the intangibles, whether it's the personality, whether it's how they would tackle a problem, right? The thinking components. What are ways that you maybe learned along the way as a founder in evaluating the right person for your team, rather than just the right skills that you need for a certain project, which is, I think, the downfall of a lot of founders when they hire, is thinking of the momentary needs versus bringing someone on to upscale and learn and tackle future needs of the team. What have been some things you've learned in not only attracting talent, but evaluating them and bringing them on and incorporating them into the team that other founders can kind of think and maybe utilize
Yeah, I think one thing we knew from the beginning is we wanted to hire people who were really smart but had low egos.
Yeah.
Because we didn't want egos to get in the way. And I think we're kind of lucky that my co-founder and I have known each other for a very long time. We knew exactly how the other person operated. And then our earliest hires, our first 3 or 4 hires, were people that either he knew or I knew.
Sure.
And so we kind of knew what we were getting. But I remember in the first couple of years, like I interviewed everybody mainly to like screen people out. And I remember like
Sure.
having a couple engineers that like were really great, really smart, but like even in the interview process, you could tell they're a little arrogant.
Sure.
And you have to assume that people are on their best behavior in the interview process.
Yeah.
And it often, I think it almost takes a founder to be like, hey, we're not hiring this person that you all love. And I remember the first time I did it, people were like, oh, thank you. Because I didn't want to say it. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, then you can say it.
Yeah.
But then a funny thing happened, I think, a couple years in, where I think we started publishing our values online. We also built a certain, remember, we're at like maybe 30 people, where I think we started just naturally attracting people who kind of fit our culture.
Yeah.
So like one thing I like to say is I think culture is like a flywheel.
Mhm.
And I think when you have really great people, I think it attracts more great people.
Yeah.
But you have to be careful, because it also becomes a flywheel the other way, where like
Right.
if you have bad people, it actually will, like the great people actually leave.
Yeah.
And then you'll end up attracting more and more bad people. So it's a
Right.
flywheel both ways. And so I think if you're not really careful about it and you don't keep a high bar and raise that bar over time, then I think you're gonna suffer. So I think like, yeah, I mean, I care more about, I may care a lot about not just how smart you are, but how you, your attitude, or you're hungry and hardworking, but also humble and high quality. I've also learned to bet on, there's this saying, I think as a Princeton professor, not my co-founder, one of his colleagues, has this saying that like, a little mathy, little nerdy, but I think hopefully your readers will appreciate this, that the slope is more important than the y-intercept.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, hey, like someone on a high trajectory will very quickly surpass someone who comes with a lot of experience.
Right.
And end up having to learn that the hard way in the beginning. Because I'm not really, it's my first database company that I built. I don't really know how open source works, and bring in some experts. And then I realized that like often experts are people who like in a fast moving industry, if you're an expert, experience can be a liability.
Yeah. Right.
Because the thing you knew is no longer true. But if you haven't adapted to the new reality, then you're, what I realized that like what I really wanted was like really high quality thinkers. And that's what I think, that's what I equate with high slope thinkers.
Yeah. Thinking about, obviously you've done many rounds of funding, you've had a lot of growth, a lot of success, the team is growing. If everything goes well, what's the long-term vision for Timescale?
Yeah, man, I love this question. Generally like new hires will ask me, hey, like what's your exit plan? Is it like an IPO? Is it an exit? I'm like, no, our goal is to build like the next great database company.
Yeah.
And one day maybe we'll go public. I think that's the path we're on, but that's not it. That's just a step on the journey. That's not the destination. The destination is to build the next great database company, that power the future of computing. Right now we have 1,000 customers. I think we do a lot better than that. We could have 100,000. How many software companies are there in the world? We have a ton. We want to be like a Mongo or a Snowflake when we grow up. We have very different cultures in those companies, but I think that's the type of impact that we want to have when we quote unquote grow up. We actually share investors with each of those companies. So we're on that path and we've made a ton of progress. We have a lot of work ahead of us. There's actually a great book called The Infinite Game. Have you heard of it?
Yeah. Never.
No, okay. So it's by this author named Simon Sinek. And it was really instruments to my thinking about entrepreneurship. The idea is that like, hey, like most games have an end. Let's say you're playing basketball or soccer or something. Like time runs out. There's a score, either won or you lost, right?
Yeah.
But like in business and in life, like there's no end. And especially, okay, life, maybe you die, right? But in business, like a company, like done well will surpass you, I hope, right? So like, what's the end? Like, how do you keep that thing going? I mean, how do you play that infinite game? And the idea for the infinite game is you can't be motivated by revenue or market share, because those things are they're like sugar, they burn off. You need to have like this deep mission. And I think for us, our mission is to like help build the future of computing, help build for the builders.
Yeah.
And we started off in time series data in industries like IoT and crypto, IT metrics, manufacturing, finance, logistics, shipping. But now we've expanded way beyond that, and we realize there's actually an even larger opportunity today to actually completely reinvent the database in the cloud, completely reinvent Postgres in the cloud.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just like the cloud today is such a huge, like, I mean, I think we're still in the beginnings of it. It kind of feels crazy. It's like, it's the dominant form of software distribution and consumption. But like, to me, I feel like today's cloud databases like Amazon RDS, like they still feel like the horseless carriage. It's kind of like applying the previous paradigm, but for in a new world. And like, one thing we've been asking ourselves, and I think we have a good answer to it, which we'll announce soon, but like, is like, hey, what if you actually reinvented the database in the cloud? Like, what could you do? And we're like, oh, well, we could build the first automobile. That actually sounds pretty cool, right? And like, doing that won't be easy, but I think, again, going back to like what I was saying earlier, we do that by staying focused on our customers, and not like, you don't do it by like trying to like capture a market. You do it by solving customer problems, but sometimes solving it with solutions that they couldn't have even imagined.
Yeah.
Like there's
What
go ahead.
What
Yeah.
does the reinvention of the database look like?
Oh man. I think a lot of things we take for granted in the cloud, we take it for granted for databases, don't need to exist in the cloud. And I think Snowflake was like an early indication of that when they decoupled the compute from storage.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot of people take that for granted, but back in the day, you would like have to provision like a server in the cloud. And now it's like, hey, you scale those two independently. I think the future, you shouldn't even have to think about that.
Yeah.
And I think serverless is like V1 of that approach, but it's like super expensive.
Right.
I think V2 will look a lot more seamless and automatic. Another book that I love, and a philosophy is prescribed to, is the Jobs to be Done philosophy. Is a book called Competing Against Luck by Clayton Christensen. And he always talks about, hey, like, have you heard about this theory?
No.
I love it. I mean, I think maybe it has some like gotchas, but I think it's a great foundation how to think about like building product and solving needs. The idea is that like, hey, like when someone goes to a store to buy like a drill, they're actually not looking to buy a drill. They're looking to buy a hole in their wall. You know what I mean? Like, that's the job they're hiring it for. And they don't really care about the drill. Maybe some people really care, but most people don't care about the drill. They just want a hole. And if you think about that, you're like, oh, well, maybe instead of selling drills, we could sell holes in the wall or whatever. You can sell it. And I think what we realize for us is that like most developers actually don't want to think about the database.
Yeah.
Like the database, it's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like your Wi-Fi connection. Like if you're thinking, if you and I right now on our call are thinking about our Wi-Fi connection, then something is wrong. Like we shouldn't think about it. Now databases are different because they're very heterogeneous. Wi-Fi is commoditized, but it's a similar idea. Like if I'm building an application, if I have to even think about the database, like am I adequately provisioned? Do I have enough scale or whatever? Then something is wrong. And so what we realize is that like the ideal database is like not having to think about the database. So you can then focus on your application and focus on your core business. So I think the future of, I think the database reinvented in the cloud will require developers to think even less than they do today about their database and they focus on their application. We'll share more soon, but I think it's really exciting. But again, I think like, again, it's being fueled by solving customer problems and power the future of computing and being driven by boldness, optimism, and urgency. I feel like this is what allows us to think big, dream big, and build the next great database company.
Yeah. I love this next section. I call it my founder FAQ. So I'm going to hit you with some rapid fire questions.
Let's do it.
And we'll see what we get. So I always like to open it up with this question. What's particularly hard about your job?
It constantly changes.
Yeah.
I have to reinvent myself every 6 months. And typically like things that were best practices like 6 months ago or 12 months ago, suddenly no longer become like anti-patterns. It's like, this thing I used to do that used to be helpful, now it actually is really not helpful. So I stop doing it. And some ways it's exciting because it keeps me on my toes and it keeps me from getting bored. But it is challenging because no one tells you when things change. That you just find out when people become unhappy, and you're like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, I need to stop doing that.
Right. Right. I'd like to ask this question. I know this question will be whether maybe it's a footnote in time or it's just a fad, but because of the growing population of AI, with ChatGPT, a lot of companies are incorporating it. A lot of companies are coming out that they've been using ML models to build AI kind of technology in their software before it became popular. Where are you sitting in that revolution in terms of the capability for it to do the more mundane, monotonous tasks a little bit more automatically and even leave more time, as you said, for people to focus on the things that are important, less so on the things that are fundamental. So like a manual hierarchy of development, having the lowest form to create the highest form of enlightenment or thought. But in terms of artificial intelligence, that whole movement, is that something you're thinking about and considering and building, or have you already started building with that type of technology into times?
Yeah, no. So we're essentially like a foundational building block for applications like that.
Yeah.
AI is another example of data intensive applications. There's a lot of data, for example, in model training and obviously and actually keeping track of model scores and also the models themselves. There are some of our customers are actually building AI applications on top of Timescale. I don't know if there's still a user, but at one point I know OpenAI was using
Mm-hmm.
Timescale. So
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of like, yeah, I'm like, we're database of the future of computing. AI is part of that.
Yeah.
And I think it's a great example of kind of the trends I was talking about. But dude, like, I am like genuinely, this is where really have to lean into my optimism. Like, I'm genuinely curious
Yeah.
about like what the future's gonna look like with the future of it. Because it's like, yeah, man, it's super. ChatGPT is disarmingly powerful.
Yeah.
Um, but we're here to build for the builders. I am fundamentally an optimist,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's where we stand on that stack. Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about how Timescale can really, I guess, fundamentally change not only OpenAI and the ability for them to operate those highly intense. I don't know if it's a piece of software or a piece of technology to operate at the scale that they're moving at. But back to you as a thought before we get into a tangent here. But something that you spend a lot of time on that you would like to spend less, and something that you spend little time on that you'd like to allocate more to.
Oh my God, I would love to spend more time with customers.
Yeah.
And as the company's gotten bigger, I get pulled into a lot of internal meetings, and and I mean I understand why I have to do that as a CEO, but I'm like, anytime I spend with a customer is infinitely more. Is so rewarding. I love it. I mean, first of all, it's inspiring to me because I'm just like, oh man, you're doing that. That's so cool. You're doing that. That's so cool.
Yeah.
And like, oh, and like customers, like a happy customer can be like, when you had like a really rough day, can be a super like helpful antidote to be like, oh, like they're really happy with the work. Cool, great.
Right.
This is
Right.
worth the effort. Do less of. I think what I talked about earlier is like the more I get pulled into these internal meetings about decisions that don't matter, I'm kind of like, hey, like make the decision.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think part of that's on me. It's like, okay, maybe
Right.
like I could create a culture that's more tolerant of experimentation and failure. So I think about that because it's like, hey,
Yeah.
if sometimes I feel like if decisions are coming to me, I'm like, okay, like you could make this decision, but you're not. That probably
Sure.
means that you're afraid of getting it wrong, or you're afraid of like the company seeing that you got it wrong.
Right.
And some things are irreversible and foundational. Okay, cool, I get that. Other things, yeah. So I think that's the thing. But again, that's probably on me to
Yeah.
again raise the bar in our culture.
Yeah. I always like to ask this question. You alluded to some books that you have found super enlightening, super helpful for your business, but let's leaning more towards people, whether you think about it early in your career or now, what are some of the people who have been highly influential in your career as a founder? And what in particular did they kind of instill in you that you've used to, whether it's fall back on in terms of it's philosophical or even strategic, what have you used in the moment to be able to move things forward or move the needle forward in that respect? Yeah. Who are some people who have been highly influential in your life, and what in particular did they instill in you that other founders can maybe use in their lives?
Yeah, and I try to be a constant student. Another one of our company values is be a lifelong student, always be learning
Yeah.
in work and personal life, and I always try to be learning it. Grows see. So I feel like I've tried to absorb a lot of best practices. But I think the most influential person is, I mentioned him earlier, is my father,
Yeah.
who is also a tech entrepreneur. He started off in the 80s in the PC revolution, and he's someone who, if you think I'm high energy, he's more high energy than me. He is more youthful than me, even though he's like 30 years older. And what I learned from him, these things I talk about, and you'll hear me say these words a lot: boldness, optimism, and urgency. Like I get from my dad, and I
Yeah.
think he's incredibly like all of us having perspective and thinking about creative solutions and always finding a solution and having this innate optimism.
Yeah.
And I think what I've realized through experience is that it's almost like, do you ski at all, Julian?
I tried to snowboard, but I mean, honestly, I just ended up hurting myself for a week and then,
Yeah, okay.
and then I think,
So maybe not, yeah. So I've been skiing probably past 30 years, and I love skiing through the trees.
yeah,
And one thing I've learned, like in the beginning, I would always look at the tree to make sure I didn't hit it.
right.
And then I learned that I became a lot more successful going down the mountain if
Uh-huh.
instead of focusing on the trees, I focused on the gaps.
Mm,
And I
interesting.
think about that a lot in life. I'm kind of like, I can think about everything that could go
Yeah,
wrong,
yeah,
but then I think I'm skiing at the tree,
yeah,
or I think about everything
right,
that could go right. No, that doesn't
right.
mean you're blind to reality. You have to realize, hey, you're in this tree. So, like,
Yeah,
seriously, like, get hurt or whatever, right? But I think by focusing on the gaps, that's what I found. It's like then your whole body just focuses on hitting that gap. You know?
yeah,
You
yeah,
naturally just gravitate towards that. And so that's how I feel about optimism. I don't think it's blind. I don't think it's about like pretending something that's not true. I think you have to accept reality. But when you
yeah,
think about how do you get out of it, you have to have this mindset where you're like, hey, there are a lot of things that could go wrong, but I'm going to be focusing on the gaps because I know if I focus on the gaps, I can better manifest the reality that I want to happen.
yeah, yeah. I love that. I mean, that's a great soundbite for sure. But last little bit is I know we've covered quite a few different topics and we're coming to the end of the show here, but I want to make sure that we didn't leave anything on the table. If there any question I didn't ask you that I should have, or anything that you would have liked to answer, anything that we left on the table here.
That's a good question. First, we're hiring. So Timescale's hiring. We're always hiring great engineers. We also have growing sales and marketing teams as well. We're fully remote. And so if this type of mission, helping build the future of computing, this type of problem, try to become the next great database company, serving developers and a fully remote culture sounds good to you, please look at our website and apply. Yeah, and if you're a software developer, if you have time series data, events, or kind of other types of kind of data intensive workloads, please check out timescale.com and then stay tuned for more in the next few months as we kind of talk about our bigger and bigger vision.
Yeah, I love that. Jay, it's been such a pleasure learning about your early experience as a founder and kind of what you've learned from your acquisition and what went well and honestly how that kind of trickled into Timescale and how you not only approach building the company, but also how you approach thinking about the industry and the impact that you can have. It's exciting to see what the long-term strategy for the company will be and how it will really change like you said, the future of computing and allow more companies to do and insights to their data and make exceptional predictions or utilize it in different ways that were are different from traditional means and having that almost supercharged power. But last little bit is tell the audience, where can we find you? Where can we support you as a founder, your company? You mentioned timescale.com, but give us your LinkedIns, your Twitters. Where can we be a
Yeah.
supporter of you?
So timescale.com, our Twitter handle is timescaledb. My personal Twitter handle is acoustic, but with a K at the end. So ACOUSTIK. I think on LinkedIn I'm just Ajay Kulkarni. There are quite a few Ajay Kulkarnis, but I think I have the Ajay Kulkarni like URL. But I am most active on Twitter.
Amazing. Ajay, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you. I hope you enjoyed yourself on Behind Company Line. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Julian.